This is Boom Bust, broadcasting around the world and covering all aspects of our global economy in the 21st century. I'm Brent Jabor.
And I'm Sarah Montes de Oca in Washington filling in. And here's a look at what we have on deck for you today.
China and Europe also share the same rejection of the trade war in which everybody loses.
As the U.S. China continue their prolonged trade spat, the People's Republic has looked to Europe to boost shipping. Professor Richard Wolff joins the program today to sift through the latest developments in global trade and what the latest developments mean for the state of the world economy. Plus, we bring back Professor Wolff for a double dose as he delves into the state of the macroeconomy in the wake of increased trade tensions and what the chances are for a recession in the United States and abroad. And later,
as U.S. China tensions continue on the rise, tech programs have found themselves in the crosshairs. Christy I is back on the show today to bring down how video sharing app TikTok has come under fire in Congress. So many stories with so little time. Let's do it. The prospects of the United States and China signing a Phase 1 trade deal may have to wait, at least beyond next week's BRICS summit in Brazil. The South China Morning Post is reporting that sources close to Beijing say President Xi Jinping's trip to Americas may be too soon for the two sides to prepare all of the particulars needed to finalize that portion of the deal. Officials from both sides have been working to find a location and date for a meeting between Presidents Donald Trump and Xi since the cancellation of the APEC summit in Chile, which was set for this month. Meanwhile, Chinese officials on Wednesday offered an olive branch to India over the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, saying the trade pact would open the door for Indian exports. At the 11th hour, India exited the trade agreement between the Asian nations, which may be the world's largest trade deal, citing a lack of benefits for the country. Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Li Yichang said while they are moving forward with the deal, India's concerns are not going unheard.
So there won't be any problem for the 15 parties to sign the RCEP next year. We are also considering the concern of India. We are taking an open attitude whenever India is ready. It is welcome to get on board.
Amid tensions with the U.S., China appears to have found common ground with France, and a recent meeting between leaders from the two countries is increasing hopes for a more global stability in trade. RT's Rachel Blevins has the details.
A trade deal has been made, but it's between China and France, and it's not clear yet if the United States will follow suit. During a meeting in Beijing on Wednesday, leaders from China and France approved $15 billion worth of commercial agreements that include the fields of finance, aviation, and environmental protection. Chinese President Xi Jinping praised the talks and said they helped give a boost to free trade.
To focus on the long term, to promote cooperation between the two countries in large-scale projects, promptly implementing the new cooperation consensus and agreement reached by the two sides in the field of nuclear energy, aviation, and aerospace.
The progress between China and France comes at a time when there is hope for Phase 1 of a trade deal between Washington and Beijing that could mark the beginning of the end in a 15-month-long trade war. French President Emmanuel Macron said he hopes his visit to China will help increase the chances of a deal with the U.S.
China and Europe share the same feeling that trade war only results in losers. So one wishes that the ongoing discussions between China and the United States permit a rapid easing of tension and take into account the interests of the great commercial partnership between China and the European community.
Talks in Beijing also resulted in a deal between the European Union and China in which they agreed to protect 100 European regional food designations known as geographical indications in China and 100 Chinese geographical indications in the EU. Now, China also renewed its commitment to intensifying international efforts in the fight against climate change through the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. This comes as Washington announces that it will formally withdraw from the agreement, and when commenting on environmental action, Macron appeared to take a shot at the U.S.
Regarding the struggle against global warming, we've been consistently moving together for years, very effectively and with a lot of engagement. I deplore the choices that some others have made, but I prefer to look upon them as marginal, because when China, Europe and Russia work together, The isolated choice of somebody or others can't change global agreement.
Meanwhile, the U.S. and China are still deciding on just how much they are willing to give up in order to finalize phase one of a possible deal, as the losses from the trade war between the world's two largest economies start to add up to tens of billions of dollars. Reporting for Boom Bust, Rachel Blevins, RT.
Huawei founder Ren Zhengfei says the Chinese telecom giant doesn't need the United States, as he sees Washington's campaign against them as ineffective. Mr. Ren told the Wall Street Journal, "We can survive very well without the U.S. We don't expect the U.S. to remove Huawei from the entity list. They may as well keep us there forever because we'll be fine without them." He went on to say he's not concerned on U.S. trade talks, U.S. China trade talks, that is, with virtually no business dealings in the United States and no confrontation with America. Mr. Ren said he would welcome a visit from President Trump now or in the future. This while Huawei confirmed the telecom giant is not yet directly engaged in conversations with any U.S. companies over the firm's proposal of selling its 5G technology. In September, Mr. Ren offered Huawei's 5G patents, licenses, codes, and even a know-how to U.S. companies for a one-time sale. He confirmed there are currently no companies talking to Huawei directly, because middlemen who have come to talk do not necessarily represent the big U.S. companies, as this is a big and difficult introduction. Meanwhile, during his visit to China, French President Emmanuel Macron also raised European concerns over Chinese tech, but thinks Huawei is right to invest in 5G technology.
I think Huawei is right to invest in 5G because it's the technology of the future. I think there are lots of European telecommunication operators that buy Huawei. I am very happy that Huawei, Nokia, Ericsson, and all the others are providers. I am simply saying that at some point, on some part of our network, it's an issue of sovereignty. So on that topic, without targeting any company, the state must have a say. European states must have a say. That's completely normal. The same way China has a viewpoint on the technology.
Global markets are hopeful that the U.S. and China will reach the phase one trade deal by the end of this month. But will it be enough to relieve these economic tensions? For more, we bring in Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Richard Wolff. Richard, thank you so much for being with us today. Let's dive right into this. President Xi Jinping is scheduled to travel to Brazil next week. Now, this is seen as the next possible chance for him to travel to the United States to sign that phase one deal. But as Brent mentioned earlier, a source close to the matter is saying that it might be too soon. Is it?
Yes, but I think there's more going on. Yeah, it could be too soon. But, you know, if they wanted it bad enough, they would speed up the calendar. I think there's something else going on here. Two things. One, the relationship between China and Brazil is extremely important to both those countries. And in a way, I think they're sending a message to Washington that if it's going to be the odd man out, if the Trump administration's trade wars with everybody are going to continue, they're going to get along real well without the United States. Just as Mr. Macron is saying in France, just as the head of Huawei was able to say for his company. And I think the mission to Brazil was to make sure that the whole world could understand the Chinese and the Brazilians have other priorities, and if the United States does not want to engage them, there's plenty for them to do with and for one another.
And now, Professor Wolff, China has been trying to get the U.S. to drop these tariffs. First off, to cancel the tariffs coming up on December 15th. Secondly, to roll back some of the existing tariffs that have already been in place. Do you see this happening at all?
Yes, I think it's been going on a little bit below the radar because, you know, the tariffs allow for exemptions. Lots of Chinese companies have asked for exemptions, and a good number of them have been given one or another kind of exemption in the United States. So there's this ongoing game. Publicly, Mr. Trump is the tough guy who's getting the Chinese to do more for America first. That's his political theater. That's what he's continuing. The demands for fundamental Chinese changes have been rejected by the Chinese from day one, and they're just as much off the table now. But here's the new problem. The economic costs to the United States, as well as to China, are becoming a political problem here in the United States for Mr. Trump, who has enough other problems with his impeachment. And so I think you're beginning to see, and will probably see more, of a shift in which Mr. Trump hopes to get a publicity boost by making a deal with China, because the benefits of the war on China have pretty much been exhausted. And that's my hope, that we'll finally see what the whole world wants with an end, if you like, to this tit-for-tat trade war.
Well, Professor, even like you said, even if a phase one deal is signed, there's more to cover, like these intellectual property theft issues, structural issues that the United States keeps arguing for China to change, and that China will not. It's part of its government. But President Trump has touted, like you're saying, time and time again, the state of the U.S. economy. In part, he's saying that it's due to his handling of the China trade deal, the China trade war. If Trump decides to remove some of the existing tariffs, do you see any backlash?
Well, I don't really know. And frankly, as a professional economist all my life, and being a person in touch with my profession, nobody, with the handful of very few, believes that the U.S. economy is great to begin with. It isn't. But even if you think it's relatively strong, the trade war with China is not the reason for it. Its strength, if you believe it, is despite, not because of the trade war, which is a hurtful phenomena. So my guess is we're going to see a preliminary deal, then we're going to see more deals, and suddenly Mr. Trump is going to have to change the story from the American economy is great because of the trade war. Now it's going to be the American economy is great because I ended the trade war. The game here is to position himself as doing something significantly positive for the economy, and the reality is nothing like that has happened, and the recognition of it is making that war look less politically attractive now than at any time from the beginning, where, to remind you, Mr. Trump said these wars are easy to win and won't take long. The truth is, they've taken very long, and he hasn't won anything.
Well, we'll see if it is actually too soon next week. It probably is, but if that phase one trade deal will even be signed by the end of this month. Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Richard Wolff. Thanks for your time, but don't go anywhere because there are some key stories we want to get your take on in the second half of the show.
And time now for a quick break, but hang here, because when we return, we bring back Professor Wolff for his take on the state of the macroeconomy in the wake of increased trade tensions and what the chances are for a recession in the U.S. and abroad. And later, as China-U.S. tensions continue to rise, tech programs have found themselves in the crosshair. Christy I is back with the show today to break down how video sharing app TikTok has come under fire in Congress. And of course, as we go to break, here are your numbers at the close.
Airbus has announced its plan to boost its jetliner production in China, adding pressure to rival Boeing. Airbus chief executive Guillaume Faury and leader of China's National Development and Reform Commission of China signed a memorandum of understanding to build more single-aisle and wide-body aircrafts in China. We attach great importance to our long-term strategic partnership with China and its aviation industry. Airbus is committed to serving this growth sector. The France-based plane maker is expanding its A330 wide-body completion center to handle its bigger model, the A350. Their first delivery is slated for 2021. This all while lifting local production of its A320neo. This is its 737 MAX competitor. The Airbus factory line is located in Tianjin. This is just 90 miles southeast of central Beijing. But this also comes as Boeing has been forced to cut back on its production. This is on its 787 Dreamliner, citing U.S. trade tensions with China and a lack of demand from Chinese carriers. Meanwhile, Boeing is looking at other potential Asian markets, India, all while it continues to deal with backlash after its 737 MAX fatal crashes. But Boeing shares have had their ups and downs since that first crash, but they seem to be pretty resilient.
The International Monetary Fund has projected that the European economy will grow at its lowest rate since 2013. In the organization's latest Regional Economic Outlook report, the IMF predicts real GDP on the continent will level off to 1.4% this year, down nearly 1% from the year prior. But we'll see a bump to 1.8% in 2020. Growth year over year for the Eurozone was just 1.1%, the weakest annual growth rate, as we mentioned, since 2013. Weakness in manufacturing and trade are pushing the numbers down in Europe, while the services industry throughout the continent remains strong. The IMF also suggested European officials make plans for a synchronized fiscal response that may be necessary to counter the stagnating economy in the region. Now, to break this all down and what this all means for the state of the global economy, we welcome back Professor Richard Wolff, author of Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Thank you for being with us again, Professor Wolff. What do we need to know about this stagnating growth in the Eurozone?
It is a very severe problem. The entire European economy, and let's remember, it's one of the 3 or 4 great economic units in the world. There are more people in the European Union than there are in the United States. The total output of that part of the world is larger than that of the United States. They are a major player. What happens in Europe ramifies all over the world. And so if they have a very severe low growth problem, which they do, and which this IMF report validates, then it's a problem for the whole world. I would want to stress one thing. Coming out of the crash in 2007 and 2008, the European Union, the countries of the Union, all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, decided that austerity was what they had to do. They had lent money to bail out the corporations, as we did here in the United States. And having borrowed money, the government did, to bail out all those companies, the government said, oh my goodness, we have all these debts, so we have to pay them off. We have to be very prudent. So they cut employment, and they were unable and unwilling to continue public services. Many people said, this austerity will come back to haunt you. It's not the way to respond to a collapsed economy. You should be doing the opposite. What we see now is the I told you so moment for the critics of austerity. And that should not be a lesson that's forgotten, because most people see another recession coming in Europe and the world, and then the same question will be posed, how do you handle it? And hopefully they will have learned the lesson that this crisis coming now, these slow growth rates, are a result of what they did last time.
Well, and bringing it back here to the United States, Bloomberg's model that determines the likelihood of a recession in the U.S. within the next 12 months shows that the number declined slightly to 26%. Now, this is down from 27% that's where it was early in October. But according to that model, recession chances are higher than they were just a year ago, but lower than other points this year. Is this just a response to some of the positive movement that we've seen within these trade talks?
No, I think it's a more fundamental issue. Look, the capitalist economic system that we live with in this world today, wherever it has existed for 250 years, on average, every 4 to 7 years, it has a downturn. We call them recessions. If they're worse, we call them depressions, downturns, crises, crashes. We have a lot of words because they're so recurring. They're called a business cycle because it keeps coming back. If the average is 4 to 7 years everywhere, including the United States, well, do the arithmetic. The last downturn was in 2008 and 9. If you add 7 years, the outer limit, we're already overdue. Anyone who follows the history of capitalism knows we're going to get one. The only question is whether we're going to get it in 4 months or 8 months. And what's going on in America that has to be understood is that the single most important goal of the Trump and Republican administration is to postpone the inevitable crisis of capitalism until after the election. Otherwise, Mr. Trump goes down to defeat. And so that's the struggle. How long can we hold it off? But the flip side of that is there's a danger. The longer you hold it off, the worse the downturn will likely be. And that dynamic is the one that really ought to concern us.
Absolutely, Professor Wolff. And I wanted to make a transition here that I don't think is too far off. But I wanted to change the gears a little bit to what we have seen with WeWork and SoftBank facing backlash for backing the tech developers like WeWork and other companies. Now, the Japanese powerhouse reported its first quarterly loss in 14 years of $6.5 billion. And all of this really stemming from the giant investment that they made into WeWork. Now, is this a trend we're seeing? What's going on here? Is this an economic concern as we look at the macro economy?
I think it's a very important issue to keep an eye on. I can't answer the question, nobody can, whether this is the beginning of the great unraveling. You know, in the beginning of the subprime mortgage crisis back in the summer of 2007, there were some people who thought it was the beginning, and there are others who thought, no, it's just one of those events. In the end, we discovered it was the beginning. Could this be that beginning again? You bet. One of the most successful, biggest, richest Japanese banks just made two colossally bad investments, losing billions of dollars because they overreached and they blew away their assets on investments they should never, ever have made. Is it an isolated event? It could be. Is it the beginning of other discoveries we're going to be making in the months ahead of investments that are going bad? How bad will it hurt SoftBank? Who will suffer among SoftBank's customers because they have to cut back, having lost so much on WeWork and so on? Those are the big questions.
And I think you're absolutely right here, Professor Wolff, because we look at a place that has always made great investment decisions, and now they really lost here. Professor Richard Wolff, author of Democracy at Work, Cure for Capitalism, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Social media app TikTok, which allows millions of users to watch 15-second videos, is facing a federal investigation over concerns that its acquisition of another app, Musical.ly, poses national security threats. Boom Bust host Christy I is in Los Angeles on assignment, but filed this report for us.
TikTok, the popular video app owned by China's ByteDance and Apple, is the latest social media company to come under heavy fire in Washington in a hearing entitled "How Corporations and Big Tech Leave Our Data Exposed to Criminals, China, and Other Bad Actors." TikTok and Apple both declined to testify at the congressional hearing Tuesday, which, as the name states, is inherently biased and unnecessarily villainized the two companies. The assembled group of experts at the hearing accused TikTok and Apple of being a cybersecurity threat. While TikTok currently stores user data in the U.S., its parent company ByteDance is headquartered in Beijing. And analysts are alarmed that this may change in 2020 when China will fully institute new cybersecurity laws. These new cybersecurity regulations lay out precise instructions on how public and private sector companies, both Chinese and foreign, must secure their networks. For foreign firms, this could mean switching to Chinese equipment, adapting international strategies, etc. Beijing is determined to become a technology powerhouse, and these new regulations are meant to protect its manufacturers, researchers, and developers from cyber attacks. U.S. intelligence analysts have interpreted these new regulations to be a threat, as it could potentially give China access to American consumer data and profiles. And as we've learned from Facebook, user data is the precious currency of social media. Because of this, TikTok is now seen as a threat to national security. TikTok is now being targeted given its links to China as well as its surging popularity in America. It was the most downloaded non-game app in the U.S. in 2019 and the world's fourth most downloaded non-game app last year. TikTok responded saying, "TikTok's data centers are located outside of China. In addition, we hired a leading U.S.-based outside auditing firm which analyzed TikTok and its data security practices, and we are committed to doing this type of audit on an ongoing basis."
While this inquiry into TikTok is not a formal investigation yet, it is happening while global tensions between China and the U.S. are high, as they are engaged in high-stakes talks over trade, technology, and internet issues. It is still unclear what the true focus and issues are, hidden under the guise of national security. Note that this was the same excuse used against Huawei. And now, with Congress's new focus on targeting big tech, it seems more and more like today, we're guilty until proven innocent.
Social media giant Facebook quietly revealed another privacy breach. This time it involved approximately 100 developers. Facebook's director of platform partnerships, Konstantinos Papameltiadis, announced in a blog post, as part of our ongoing review, we recently found that some apps retained access to group member information, like names and profile pictures in connection with group activity from the group's API for longer than we intended. This also comes more than a year after Facebook cracked down on how much personal data third parties could actually access. Major changes were made by the social media giant back in 2018 following the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But still, these 100 app developers had access to users' data through Facebook private groups in the last 60 days. The blog post said there was no evidence of abuse, and while no specific apps were named, he said they were primarily social media management and video streaming apps, but no further details were provided.
And that's it for this time. You can catch Boom Bust on youtube.com/BoomBustRT. See you next time.
And it's now time for your global stock market walk for the week.
This would actually mark the slowest year-over-year growth.
If wages are flat, even setting aside concerns about equity and human welfare. The most from this trade war that he's chosen to initiate with China. Want more Boom Bust? Of course you do. Then don't forget to subscribe.